Peter Bertacci was a professor of philosophy at Boston University when I was a student there. Bertacci was not only a fine teacher, he took a very active interest in his students. He used to tell the story of one of his students who was quite attentive to his work and attentive in his classes. But this young woman was paralyzed virtually in both arms. She had enough use of her right arm that she could gather up a pen in between two fingers, and while bending over her desk, write notes while Bertacci lectured. Bertacci lectured quite rapidly and had a lot of feeling and emotion in what he said and did, and when one listened carefully, one wrote a lot. And this young woman would sit there with that pen, it seemed awkwardly gripped between those two fingers, and she would write furiously. Bertacci noticed her, of course, and often noticed that she would sometimes be in pain, and the pain would be etched on her face, and struggling to keep up, and obviously needing to stop writing, but she simply refused to. She just kept on taking notes and bearing through the pain. One day he stopped her at the door as the class was leaving and asked her if she had a minute. She said, "Of course." He said, "You know, I've been watching you. You go through a lot to be here, don't you?" She said that she did. And he said, "You know, I'd like to know the story. What happened to you? What happened to the arms?" Well, I was one of those kids, many of us, you know, in my generation, got polio. And I went through the whole affair, the iron lung, the hospitalization, and the rest. And finally, after what seemed an interminable length of time, they told me that I could go home, but that I really couldn't go home until I had certain kinds of physical therapy. They told my mother that they could actually train her to do the therapy, but they weren't sure at all that she could do it because it would be very painful, and because I would not like it. They felt that my mother would not be able to administer the kind of massage and treatment required. My mother simply responded, "Teach me, I'll do it." When we got home, my mother every day would take me into my room, pull down the windows, close the door, and Dr. Bertacci, she would begin to rub. And I cannot tell you how much that hurt. At first I would implore her to stop, pleading with her, "Please stop." When that didn't work, I would begin to cry. I would bawl, and then I would beg her, "Please, please, Mother, stop." And when that didn't work, then I began to call her names. I called her every name I could think of, and I even made up a few. But my mother kept on rubbing. After those sessions would end, my mother would leave her room, go to her room, close the door, and cry. Dr. Bertacci, that went on every day for a solid year. Bertacci dropped his eyes to the floor, obviously moved, but when he did, the young woman raised that one arm and said, "But Dr. Bertacci..." I see that story as a parable of God. A God who is with us, who refuses to absent self from us when we suffer and when we're hurt and when we're in pain. I see that as a God who suffers for us, that God's suffering is very, very active. That's meant a great deal to me. But I recently read David Kelsey's article in the Christian Century where he said an additional thing. He says it's not really enough for God to be with us and God to suffer with us. you need one other thing. And he argues that what you need is God's active love of us in our suffering and our pain. And I think in that story you get that kind of active love of that mother in her daughter's suffering and pain. And the kind of strength, the word comfort is very appropriate here, and the kind of comfort that represents. In the death of my own son, who was killed accidentally on a motorcycle, I personally experienced exactly that kind of God. I never believed that God intended the death of our son. I believed then, as I do now, that Stephen died by accident. At the same time, I also believed that no one was in greater pain over Steve's death than God, and that God was not only actively with us, but suffered with us during that time. You see, I never believed that God willed those kinds of tragic things to happen in the world. I'd been taught at a place called Millsaps College, Boston University, and St. Paul's School of Theology that God did not bring that kind of evil on people. I believed that then. I believe it now. The God who worship is a God who actively loves us in those times. After Steve's death and the funeral and all the hard times that represented, and being undergirded by that kind of understanding of God's relationship to us in suffering and the rest, I do remember one night I was at home by myself. Everyone was gone. We'd had a tough time in addition to Steve's death. The dog that he had given us died within days of his death. And I believe that it was a death somehow in sympathy with Steve. And then our daughter's marriage split within a week of Steve's death. But that night I had tried to start the car, and even the car wouldn't work. It wouldn't crank. I remember standing in the bathroom, just feeling this rage. I suppose rage about Steve's death, rage about that divorce, rage about the dog's death, but it took that triggering of the car, not starting. And I found myself simply yelling at the top of my voice at God. If a neighbor heard us, they had to think I was crazy. And I was calling God names, quite frankly. And when I blew that out and just turned it loose, suddenly I experienced an intimacy with God that would match any time I ever spent in relationship with God. I remember a calm, I remember a peaceable feeling. I remember a sense that finally these things would come to a completion in God that would sustain all of us and in our part of the world hold it together.